Okay, fine. So, I hope you all are fine. Enjoying history? No, don't try ever to explore history, right? Only enjoy history and just prepare it for the sake of UPSC only, right? Don't get misguided by this, this taste, or we can say other things, right? So basically, as we have started discussing the history writing, right? So in the last class we did discuss about basically what are the problems with the history writing, right? So basically, as we have we did discuss that's actually what was happening, that most of the people, those who tried to write anything, whatever, right, they tried to write, somehow this could not be categorized in history because they were having certain problems, and those problems we have discussed. And somehow, I don't know that this question is directly coming or not, but sometimes, or we can say every time, we can utilize these kind of things while writing the answer, because until and unless you understand the nature of the history writing, right, history writing in India, somehow we won't be able to understand it perfectly, right? That's the reason that we are discussing about these kind of things, because once we are beginning the syllabus, so somehow it is not possible for me also, or for you also, it is going to be tough to understand in between that what kind of trends were there in history writing. So that's the reason that I decided to initially discuss this, right? So now, as far as this history writing is concerned, so we have already discussed some of the things regarding the writing of history in India, right? So as I told you that once this colonial people are coming, and finally what happened, they decided to write down the history of India. It seems very simple, but it was not that much simple, right? Because once this British East India Company is coming into power, right, and in fact so many processes, and basically that was the phase when the Western powers were interacting with the Indian people, and somehow there were so many ideologies which were coming up, and these all ideologies were somehow trying to understand the Indian society, trying to understand the Indian culture, right? And in that process, they have started writing, something about India. And in fact, as I told you in the last class only, that somehow they felt one thing, at least in the medieval period, people had certain amount of consciousness regarding the history, but that could not be seen at all during this ancient period. And that is why these people thought of revising the history, or we can say rewriting the history, not rewriting, in fact writing the history during this particular period, right? So as I told you that yes, initially what happened, they started doing this translation works, right? And during this process of translations, ultimately those huge compilation of such works came, right? And out of these compilations, ultimately what is happening, there is a group which is coming known as Orientalist group, right? So we can say this is the first group which started writing the history of India. You write something and then we'll move ahead. The British East India Company established Asiatic Society of Bengal on 1784 to translate various ancient Indian, you just do it, ancient Indian classical text. Which somehow under the influence of William Jones. William Jones was a great Indologist. Indologist, who had studied Sanskrit, and was much interested in Indian past. The early translations included Manusmriti, Bhagavad Gita, and some other text. Only the North Indian text. South Indian history is already, it was always secluded, right? And people have started studying South Indian history much late. Because, these people, as it's very simple to understand, they have colonized the northern part first, right? And that is why initially they were focused in the northern part of India only, right? And that is why they just wanted to understand the culture of North India. And somehow they could never realize one thing, that the development of the South Indian society is it happened in an altogether different way, right? And that is why they always tried to generalize the thing, right? They always found that what we have studied for the North India, the same is true for the South India as well. Unfortunately, it was not true, right? And that you do know that after 1940s, basically a person like Neelkant Sastri and all, they have started studying about the South Indian history and the history of South India. This is the name of the book which was written by Neelkant Sastri. So the South India is coming into limelight much late. So nothing we are going to discuss about this, South India right now. It's all about North India and the North Indian text, right? The first thing. The second thing, which is again very important, once you are saying South India, so yes, if you are having a single perspective, actually these people had a single perspective. Why I am saying, saying that these people had a single perspective? Because as you do know, after the Sangama literature, the Brahmanism has already reached South India, right? And in fact, there might be a very vague Varna system in South India, but still it was present in South India. And somehow that is why these people could not, decipher, or these people could not have, judged this properly, that the South Indian society is different. They found that all Indian societies are similar, and that is why they were never interested in, studying the South Indian society in a different way, right? Continue. So, okay, somehow I think whatever we have dictated, that is very clear, that that we have discussed earlier also. And somehow, as I told you, that William Jones was, a person from, Europe, and he was much interested in, this study of Indian past, and that is why he came to India, right? And under the influence of that, particular fellow, ultimately this institution was established, right? And as it got involved in numbers of translations, and after these translations, definitely out of these kind of translations, ultimately these people have started coming up with certain conclusions, right? So now definitely they had a sort of idea or agenda, but somehow even we can say that these people, basically those Indologists or the Orientalists, they were very much inspired, or they were very much astonished by seeing the Indian culture. And once they saw such kind of translation, so definitely, at least in terms of philosophy, right, India had always excelled, right? So once they are reading this or studying this Manusmriti or Bhagavad Gita, or there was another book, what was his name? That's a story book, no? No, it's not. That book was also translated, right? And one more book was there. What was the name of the book that you told? Panchatantra. And one more book was there. I'm just missing the name of the book. So these are the books. No, not Upanishad. It's a sort of story book like Panchatantra. It's quite similar to Panchatantra. I'm missing the name of it. I'll let you know, right? So somehow what happened? So somehow they got astonished, and in fact these people got very surprised that the Indian people were very rich in terms of philosophies, right? And that is why, as far as the Orientalists are concerned, so we can't say that these people were very much biased. In fact, these people were in a mood to praise the Indian culture and Indian society. But during this process, or while they were in this process, right, they came up with some wrong conclusions also, right? So you just write down, change the paragraph and write. while they were involved while they were involved in such processes, they started coming up with so many new discoveries, such as the Indo-European languages, Aryan race, Chandragupta Maurya. Right? Now, there is no need to go further, but let me explain this. Right? In fact, I hope if you have studied little bit history, in that case you must be having one idea that what happened. People never knew, the Indian people never knew about Chandragupta Maurya, and in fact there was no Indian source which talked about Chandragupta Maurya. Right? It's late, later it was happening that some Buddhist sources or the Jaina sources did mention about Chandragupta Maurya. Initially they were not aware of Chandragupta Maurya, or there was a ruler like Chandragupta Maurya. Right? So somehow, as you do know, I am beginning the discussion with Chandragupta Maurya because this is really amazing, and in fact, as you do know, in some of the Western writings Chandragupta Maurya has been discussed. Right? Why? Because Alexander was having its clash or war against this. No, exactly he was not having any war directly with him, but somehow they were aware of Chandragupta Maurya, and in fact Seleucus Nicator was having certain kind of relationship with Chandragupta Maurya, and that is why in Western writing, basically in Greek writings, you will find that the fellow has been mentioned with the name of Cendrocotus or Androcotus. Right? So somehow they they just concluded it in a way that there must be a very great ruler in India, and in fact once later on they found the name of Chandragupta Maurya like in Arthashastra or Indica or some other writing, and then they tried to equate Chandragupta Maurya with the Cendrocotus or Androcotus. So somehow for the first time they were the people came up with the history of Chandragupta Maurya. So in fact, as you can understand, the person who founded the Mauryan dynasty, right? So definitely it was a great achievement of that, right? But something which is greater than this, definitely it is the concept of Indo-European language, right? So what exactly is this concept of Indo-European languages, right? So basically the Indo-European language is basically about William Jones, right? He had very good idea of languages, and that is why what he did, he actually tried to find the similarities between the European languages and Sanskrit, right? And in fact he is saying the early Persian, right, Sanskrit, and then some other European languages such as Latin, Greek, and some others, right? These are having very common features, right? Such as we can see few terms, such as we can talk about like Pitar, right? So the Pitar is the term which is in English father, right? And Pitar is a Sanskrit word. So there is a similarity between these two words. Same is true for Mitar, right? Mitar is mother. Bhratar is brother, right? So he is saying, look, these all words are having, definitely these all languages, right, evolve from a single sort of tradition, and that is why these are sharing some common systems or the common words, and that is why he gave one theory which is known as the concept of Indo-European language, right? And somehow this became one of the most important argument to prove that the Aryans somehow migrated from the Central Asia to Indian region, right? So definitely this is one of the greatest achievement of this fellow. The next important, I just told you about the Aryan race, right? So once it is about Aryan race, so as you do know, that there's a phenomena, although these people were not that much biased, the early Orientalists, right? But even though the one thing that they tried to prove is the Aryans are basically responsible for the developed Indian societies, right? So somehow they are not trying to prove it. It was just because of the West that India got such kind of advanced level of life, or they were so much advanced in terms of philosophy and religion. But even though they tried to prove this idea that it is all because of the Aryan race, and somehow, as you do know, that people were not much aware of Indus Valley civilization, and as they were not aware of Indus Valley civilization, so they just thought in fact this is one of the thing which is very much true, that if we'll talk about the cultured people, right, in the world. So as you do know about Africa, you do know about America, nowhere will find that any sort of civilization was there, whether India was much ahead of such kind of, or as compared to these cultures, or basically these tribal people, because America was all about red Indian people, right? Africa is all about that Negro people, right? So somehow everywhere will find these kind of people, whether India was very much civilized as compared to these people. So somehow they were actually astonished in what way these people could come to this level up or this stage. And that is why what happened, now they found okay, fine, the Aryans are moving from that way, from Central Asia to India, and somehow they were responsible for such kind of thing. So Rig Veda was also translated, and somehow this conclusion is also very important, right? But okay, these are some successes of the early Orientalists, right? And here onwards, what is happening, basically the the study of the Orientalist people got diverted into two different directions, right? One which was led by person like Max Müller, right? And the another the another thing which was started by basically some archaeologists, right, such as Cunningham and James Prinsep, right? So in fact here onwards the Orientalists got divided into two directions, right? So first let write a heading: the development of Indo-logical studies. After William Jones, the Indo-logical studies developed along two lines. The first was the critical study of ancient Indian text and documents, which was led by Colebrook, and Max Müller. Colebrook was a mathematician. Studied Sanskrit, and tried to recover the Vedas. this fellow tried to prove the similarities between Rig Veda and Jain Avesta, Rig Veda and Jain Avesta, which was a Central Asian text. Full stop. Whether Max Müller after learning Sanskrit translated numbers of manuscripts with the name the Sacred Books of East series. The Sacred Books of East series. Right? Somehow his efforts helped us to understand the ancient Indian civilization. The second group, change the paragraph. The second group started studying archaeological discoveries, old inscriptions, coins and monuments. Which was led by Cunningham and Max Müller. Their efforts also helped the contemporary people to create the history in a better way, as now the archaeological sources as the archaeological sources were also used. Change the paragraph. Definitely these Orientalist people tried to understand Indian past in a modern way. Now the Indians also came to know about their glorious past. Such as Chandragupta, the Indo-European languages, Asoka, etc. Next, it was their effort that the scripts such as Brahmi got deciphered. Which definitely facilitated the history writing. Apart from this, definitely the whole world got aware of Indian past. And many Europeans also got interested in Indian culture and person like Kalidas and all, and persons like Kalidas and all became popular even in West. Right? So I hope you got the point that these Orientalist people. What happened to you? Achha, you were just waiting for the class. There in room number 3. Right? Yeah. Please. Sorry, Asokan? Okay, Ashokan pillars were not deciphered. No, James Prinsep was the first fellow who deciphered the Ashokan inscriptions.
He discovered the display from there. Before it was also staying there.
I'm not getting your question. Can you?
I'm asking that the Ashokan Stupa, Sachi Stupa are there.
Cunningham was the fellow who deciphered the Ashokan, so the Sachi Stupa. Cunningham.
Stupa is there.
Yeah, it's there.
But didn't know about it is Stupa.
Well, it is not like that. I think again, you are also from engineering background. No, then? Sorry? Literature. Okay, fine. Look, normally what happens, na, sometimes there are definitely something, right? And it is just remain there. But somehow we people don't know about that. Getting my point? And that is why we people are not, we are not bothering much about that, what exactly it is, what is the use of that. So, if you imagine that Sachi Stupa was a very glorious stupa, and in fact, definitely it was in a very destructed, way. I mean, it was not the way you imagine the Sachi Stupa, it was not like in that way. It was in a ruined condition, right? And that is why people hardly, because in India, you'll find so many such kind of monuments. What was the significance of stupa that people came to know only once they knew about the Buddhism? Getting my point or not? Right? You are not satisfied. I think you are just asking something else.
So I'm asking, sir, Stupa is there. So people don't know about that.
That is what I am just trying to answer. To know about the stupa, you have to be aware of your past. Then only you can realize or you can understand the importance of the structure. Right? If you don't understand the importance of this, right? Let me tell you one thing. I mean, suppose.
Chanakya wrote this book.
Huh. But nobody knew about Chanakya also, no? Nobody knew about Arthashastra also. So suppose you are a rural fellow, okay? You are coming from a village, right? And you don't know at all about this dollar and all. You have only seen rupees in your life, right? And somebody is giving you $1. Would you respect that? Would you respect the dollar? Of course not. Why? Because for you it's a piece of paper. But if you do understand or realize, okay, this dollar, it means if it is a note of $100, it means 6,000 rupees, right? Then you'll keep it very safely. Getting my point? So those ruins are there. We didn't know about the importance of those ruins, right? Okay, it's a stupa, and it actually it reflects about the glorious past of the Ashoka, the glorious past of the Buddhism. So if we know about Sachi Stupa, and that is where we find okay, it's a very good structure, right? And we must respect that structure, we must protect that structure. You know about Buddhism, you know about Ashoka, and that is why we react in that way. If you didn't know about Ashoka or you didn't know about the Buddhism, definitely you would not have respected in that way. It was there. Nobody was bothering for this. Okay, let it be. In India, there were so many monuments. There are still so many monuments which are in a very ruined condition. I hope that you must be knowing. Right? People are not hardly giving any importance to them. Today only I was just reading a story regarding the Bhimbetka caves. It was there. Nobody never bothered about the cave. There was an archaeologist, some Kakingan, right? And one day he was just traveling from Bhopal to Itarsi, right? And he just saw something and he found it quite peculiar from the train only. As he was an archaeologist, right? He knew about the importance of these things. He got down in the next station only, came back to the place, right? And then he discovered that Bhimbetka. So now it has become a tourist spot, right? So it is very much necessary that you are aware of your past or not. If you are not aware of your past, these things hardly matter. And in fact, if you find that there are few things which are very safely maintained yet, right? That is because of the government, right? The government is trying to maintain it, and finally it is giving some revenue also to the government in return. That's a different case, right? But so far you just imagine the thing that if you are not aware of your past, definitely there was no people hardly bothered for these kind of things, right? So it was always there. It is not true that later on the Britishers got the stupa from somewhere and they placed it in Sachi, something like that. No, definitely. Right? Okay, fine. So okay. No, you are not again. You people are again mistaking, right? The Vedas were there, they were aware of the Vedas also, right? But the Vedas have never been treated as a source of history. Getting my point, right? So Vedas, like the Ramayana is there at your place, or whatever it is, Quran or Ramayana, right? So whatever, but it may be possible, right? At least in Hinduism, it is happening that Ramayana is there, Gita is there, right? Everything is there in the house, but nobody actually reads those texts. Isn't that true? होता है ना, यही होता है, huh? No, they never read anything as, I mean, okay, it is there. In fact, I'm around 40, right? I have never studied Gita, Ramayana, anything, right? So that tradition was not there. So somehow, okay, it might be possible that there was some religious fellow, some Pandit, and they all must be reading these Vedas and all. And in fact, I'm very sorry to say these kind of things, that in India, Hinduism, or basically the nature of this particular priestly class, was more commercial rather than religious, right? They always use religion to exploit people, to make some money and all, right? There were very few people, those who are really scholars, right? Those who have studied the Vedas, those who have studied the Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishads, they are very less number of people. And those who have studied this, so they are actually a scholar, and they are not doing, or they are not running their dukan just to get some, money and all. These people are just involved in some spiritual thinking and all, right? So that's the reason. So if some people knew about those Vedas and so they were secluded from the normal life, right? The first thing. The second thing, the Indian, those people who knew about Vedas and those who could read the Vedas, because Sanskrit, they knew Sanskrit, right? They could read the Vedas, right? But somehow it was more commercial for them rather than something very important. The third thing, there was no sense of history, and that is where they never tried to extract some sort of history from those texts. That's the reason, right? Okay, fine. So I did discuss about some positive sides, right, of the Orientalist people. Yes, there were certain positive sides, and in fact, because of that, or we can say the Orientalists definitely started a new tradition in India, right? And because of what, definitely the Indians somehow could know about their past. The first thing, the world got, or the world got aware of the Indian past, right? And it is not only about the Indian past, they got interested in some other things also, right? Once they came to know about, there are some great novels written by the ancient people, they got interested, right? And they started studying Sanskrit, and that's the reason that finally most of the Western universities had to start a chair with the name of Orientalism. In most of the foreign universities, you'll find a department called Orientalism, right? And most of the Indian professors that you do know, that okay, these are the professors, and Indian professors, those who are teaching in the European universities or American universities, basically they are working in this department only, Orientalism. Or basically there is a department which is also known as, in the present days, Southeast Asian Studies. I hope you might have heard, right? So that Southeast Asian Studies is basically nothing but the Orientalism, right? So I hope you can understand the importance of Orientalism, because the whole world got interested. And once I say world, it meant only Europe, right? I mean, America was still struggling for its independence and all. Africa was not important at all, right? So it's only about Europe and Central Asia, definitely certain parts of Central Asia. So yes, that's the another importance of this year. But at the same time, you must remember, definitely these people had certain negative aspects as well, right? So what are the negative aspects? Definitely they had certain negative aspects, and the most important side of, or negative side of the Orientalism was that while creating the history, they got some wrong traditions, right? And these wrong traditions, even though later on people discarded those wrong traditions, but they were so dominant in the Indian minds, still we people could not go beyond that, such as the concept of Aryan race, or the dominance of the Aryan race. That because now the way they have imagined, right? The way they have imagined that India is whatever India is right now, that was just because of the Aryans, right? So most of the people, those who discarded also this theory, right, they simply tried to discard it. It means that that particular theory has become so important that the negation, or the negation became very important, right? So even though they are trying to negate it, but somehow this idea became so dominant that still people are struggling with those questions, right? Still some people are talking about that Aryan and all. Still that debate is on. that Aryans were actually the Indian people, or they were coming from Tibet, or there were so many arguments are there. Still some historians are there. I mean, recently also I came to know about one thing, that some historians were saying, there was a historian who was saying that actually the Aryans are the indigenous people. So still we people are trying to carrying the same legacy, right? So somehow they started few wrong tradition, and we Indians are still struggling with that, right? So that was the most negative part of the Orientalism, right? Continue. The Orientalist definitely had certain negative aspects as well. Such as the concept of Aryan race, the ignorance to the Dravidians, the superiority of the upper caste, etc. Although these ideas were negated later on, but these are so dominant in Indian history writing, that still the historians struggling against these. Next, British imperialist or colonial history writing or historiography. Oh, that's a different. I mean, we are just discussing this history writing, so that's the next group actually. This is the next group. So you have the way you have written the Orientalist. Now the next you write British imperialist. Have you ever, so far, have you seen any book on history? Which one? No, I'm not asking about that. I'm just asking in the historical context, right? So far, Orientalists have come. They have done numbers of discoveries. They have number of research, right? They have deciphered the script of A. But have you seen any book of history so far? No. No book has been written so far, right? Because William Jones never tried to write history on India, right? And then Cunningham also never tried to write them. They are writing something, but specifically on their own topic or of research, right? They never tried to write the history of India. And that's the point which was somehow now the imperialist historians, they are utilizing this, right? They try to utilize it. And that is where the first history, the official history which is coming from this side, not from the Orientalist side, right? Okay, fine. So you write it was so unfortunate, but the first important history of India came not from Orientalist side, but the great opponent James Mill. These imperialist authors utilize the Orientalist understanding and their research started writing the history on India definitely the first effort was done by James Mill. First effort was done by James Mill, which is known as History of India. Then by Elphinstone. Mount Stuart Elphinstone. And the name of the book was History of Hindu and Muhammadan India. History of Hindu and Muhammadan India. History of Hindu and Muhammadan India. These people had a biased idea and for them history was simply a tool. History was simply a tool. To justify the colonial rule on India. So far, some governor generals were supporting the Orientalist idea, were supporting the Orientalist idea, but now the utilitarian became the dominant ideology. I hope you remember the name of such people, those who were supporting the utilitarian ideas in the early phase, such as Elphinstone, Munro, right. These were some people who were supporting this idea, and somehow because of their effort, what is happening now, right, that these people were promoted in history writing, right. Getting my point or not? These are the utilitarian people. For them, the Indian society is highly uncivilized people. They are just having an orthodox system. They are just having a very decayed system, right, and that is why there is no utility of following this system. Whether the Orientalist people were never seeing like that. I hope, let me compare with some other things, you will be able to understand. I hope you remember Warren Hastings, right? You might have heard about Warren Hastings, right? So once Warren Hastings, it was the phase of 1772, right? So once we'll discuss about the Warren Hastings. So in administration, most of the time he continued the ancient Indian, or the Indian traditions, right? Whatever the system he found when he is coming into the administration, he tried to continue the same system. Either it is judicial system or it is about the land revenue collection system. So mostly he tried to continue with the same system. But the people like Munro, and in fact, as you do know, that this system, the permanent settlement, you might have heard about permanent settlement, was nothing but a sort of continuity of this Indian tradition, like Jamindars are there and peasants are there. Jamindars got the right to collect the land revenue, right? But as you do know, people like Munro and Elphinstone, right? They changed the Indian tradition, right? Now they are coming the Rayatwari system, and as per the Rayatwari system, what is happening? As per the Rayatwari system, as you do know, now there is no existence of Jamindars in this system, right? Kisan or the peasants were basically, they were although declared as the owner of the land, right, but practically they were not the owner of the land. In fact, it was the state which became the owner of the land, right. So in fact, we'll do all such kind of things later on. I'm just trying to make you understand. So some governor generals are there, those who are supporting the ideas of the utilitarians, right, and that is where these people got a promotion and they started writing the history of India, right. But as you can understand, somehow they always found the Indian system as a rotten system, right, and that is why they never had they were never in a mood to praise the Indian culture and society. At the other side, what is happening? They had to justify the colonial rule in India, and as they had to justify the colonial rule, and that is why these people have started putting some wrong conclusions also regarding the Indian society, right. So write it first and then we'll discuss. Next paragraph. As the imperialist historians had to justify the company rule on India, that is why they desperately gave some biased conclusions, such as India was a India as a stagnant society, India as a stagnant society, comma, Oriental despotism comma, Aryans responsible for the development of Indian society, etc. Later on, change the paragraph, sorry. Later on, some British imperialist administrative historians, also started writing on Indian history. With same objective. The best example for this was the book of William Hunter, the books of William Hunter, in bracket you write down Indian Musalman, dash 1876, and Vincent Smith, the early, in bracket, the early history of India, 1900. Well, I won't give you much detail. I'm just telling you something, right? Look, the book Indian Musalman, right? And what was the age when the book was written? What was the 1876, right? Can you relate it with somebody else? Something else? Why this book has been developed, Indian Musalman? To divide and rule. After 1857, they have realized one thing. What was what was realized by them? Look, so far, I mean, till 1857, they always thought that actually it is the Muslim community which always wanted to remove the colonial people from here or the Britishers from here. But after 1857, they actually realized the opposite thing, right? They thought it is not the Muslim. In fact, as it happened that the Muslims were with the company while suppressing the revolt, and in fact they realized that ultimately it is the Hindu community, specifically the Bengalis, right, and the people from the Uttar Pradesh, right, they are the people those who are those who wanted to remove the colonial rule from India, and that is why they came up with a new policy which is informally known as divide and rule. It was not a formal policy, right? And now if they wanted to follow this particular policy, in that case they had to prove something. I think if they wanted to get the support of the Indian Muslim community, so they had to prove something, right? So he desperately wrote the book Indian Musalman, right? And in that book what he did actually, he just tried to prove that the Muslims are actually the backward, Muslims are backward, and there are few reasons for that. And somehow it is very much possible, the idea which was suggested with the book, through the book, that it is very much possible that if the Muslims are coming closer to the Britishers, in that case they could share the power with the Britishers, and somehow they could improve their situation. So it was a desperate, effort, right? Same is true for that fellow, the Vincent Arthur Smith, right? So Vincent Arthur Smith, he has written this book which is known as the Early History of India, right? And mind you, that early basically is the ancient India, right? And that book has been written in 2 volumes, right? And you just tell me one thing, if you are writing the history of India, so what is the status of Alexander in ancient India? Definitely he is an invader, right? And that fellow, he hasn't even entered into the main land of India. He could not cross the river, right? Jhelum, right? And finally he had to return from there only. So somehow, if we'll talk about the real Indian land, he could not enter also even in India. And somehow, if we'll read the book of Vincent Arthur Smith, you'll find that 1/3 of the book has been dedicated to Alexander, right? So I hope you can understand that they always wanted to justify one thing, and in fact that's the reason that the Kusanas and Sakas have always been glorified, because they always wanted to prove with the help of these people that they are the real founder of India rather than the Indian people, right? So that's the idea which was working in their mind, and because of that we can say it was an biased history, but somehow they are the fate maker, they were the destiny makers of India in that particular time, and somehow they started doing that, right? So that is basically the colonial writing, right? And finally, we can say ki finally, because of them, right, we find a group, because of the efforts of all such people, there's another group which is coming up known as imperialist historiography. Imperialist historiography. Yeah. Yeah.
First, what is Oriental despotism?
Okay, fine. Oriental despotism. Sorry, okay, it will come in many times. It will come many times in the curriculum. What exactly is Oriental despotism? Look, while writing, these people always compared the Indian society with the Western society, right? And while comparing, they always found that the rules which were there in India, these were always despotic rule. Do you understand despotic? Despotic is basically the opposite word to democracy, right? So once democracy is about the the wills of the masses, where the despotism means the will of the ruler, right? So they always try to prove that if any kingship is there, any king is there, that king was always despotic. It means that there was no notion of welfare for the common masses. Do you think it is true? Do you find that Ashoka was having same kind of thing? If you read Arthashastra, you'll find that Ashoka was a person who was very benevolent, right? And in fact, it is not about Ashoka. There were so many rulers, the Gupta rulers, right? And there were so many other rulers. So somehow despotism means that the king's will is the ultimate reality. That is not true, because as you know, because we haven't discussed these kind of things over the time. These will come into the discussion. That if we'll talk about the state, right? For state, there was one thing which was always required, that was legitimacy, right? That was legitimacy. Do you understand this legitimacy? Narendra Modi is ruling on us. Why? Because he is legitimized by us, right? And that is why he is ruling on us, right? Isn't that true? Right. Do you think that if you would not have voted Narendra Modi, and Narendra Modi would have become the Prime Minister? Is it possible? No. So look, we are always legitimizing someone to rule. So okay, it could be discussed in democracy. What about the autocracy, right? Or what about the the empires and the kingdoms? Okay, fine. We are not legitimizing them, right, directly, but yes, indirectly the subject population always legitimize them also, right? If you are talking about Chandragupta Maurya, right? If you are talking about Chandragupta Maurya, so okay, fine. Chandragupta Maurya had a huge army, but do you think that if the masses would have revolted against Chandragupta Maurya, the Chandragupta Maurya would have suppressed the revolt with the help of army? No, this is not possible. Chandragupta Maurya could fight against the enemies with the help of the army, but Chandragupta Maurya could not fight against the subject population. So their will was very much required for them to be in power, right? Now let us connect with some other thing. Do you think that why do you think that Chandragupta Maurya was supporting Jainism, right? His son Bindusar was supporting Ajivika sect. His son Ashoka was supporting the Buddhism. Have you ever thought why these people were doing like that? The very simple reason: support the religion which is actually supported by the mass. As you do know, that period is known for a religious revolution, right? And in fact, people were much disturbed or suffocated because of the Brahmanism, right? So what they did actually, the people got very much influenced by Buddhism and Jainism. They also they started supporting Buddhism and Jainism. What was the point of that? There was a very simple point, right? There is a very simple point. Ultimately, if you are supporting the same religion, so that religion is somehow legitimizing you to rule. That religion is giving you the guarantee that the subject populations are with you. If they are supporting, the subject population would have been supporting Buddhism, right? And Ashoka would have been continuing, would have continued supporting, Brahmanism. There might be a clash, right? So that is why legitimacy was always required, right? And in fact, this is not true for this period. Why do you think that Akbar was a great social reformer? Why Akbar had a policy towards Rajput like that? Akbar was very powerful. Definitely, he could have implied, more power and could have suppressed all the Rajput rulers. But realize one thing: just by suppressing them, the Rajput people are not going to legitimize him. What's the best way to legitimize? Establish some matrimonial relationship, right? And this Vatan Jagir. So he just tried to satisfy the ego of the Rajputas, right? And at the same time, he tried to utilize the Indian system. That in Indian system, the son-in-law always treated respectively, right? And that is why he just did that, right? So legitimacy is always a big question. So do you find if people are struggling, that much just to get the legitimacy, and at the same time they were following this, principle of Oriental despotism? Of course not. Yeah. Both the things could not go parallelly. In fact, it is impossible. But they desperately tried to get such kind of ideas into Indian society, right? Indian society always having this Oriental despotism. They did not, and they tried to compare with some Greek society, because yes, there were certain Greek societies, right, which had the a concept of some republican systems and all, right. So they thought the Romans and the Greeks were already aware of this republican system, right, and that is why what is happening. The Indians were basically Orientally, they were following the system of Oriental despotism, right. Okay, fine. The imperialist historiography. This was the culmination of the tradition which was started by the Orientalist. They also discussed what did you write? They also discussed about the same concepts such as stagnant or static society, Oriental despotism, the wrong periodization in bracket you just write down Hindu, Muslim and British period. And Aryan and Aryan invasion. An Aryan invasion. But the only area where they differed was that they applied some broader theories of history such as Hegel's philosophy, Hegel, H-E-G-E-L, Hegel, Hegel's philosophy of history. What have you got any idea about Hegel? You just tell me something about Hegel. You must have studied about this Hegel and Marx and all. Hegel you must have heard, must have studied also. Look, now person like Hegel, first definitely this idea where has been started by Hegel, and Hegel is basically responsible for defining history, right? Once you talk about history, the one thing that we always do discuss while defining history, that is change. Getting my point? Right? Whenever we are trying to study history, we have to focus on change. In fact, many times I have discussed about this continuity and change. That is one real nature of the history, right? So as per Hegel, basically the society, it's talking about, whenever you are talking about any society, so some classes are there, and because of the classes, ultimately some changes are taking place, right? And that is known as the Hegelian idea of history, right? Later on, it was revived by Marx, and it was slightly changed also by Marx. That is dialectic materialism, right? That is the idea of Marx, which has been given somehow, right? So if it is about change, right? So now, So now you just try to apply the idea, right? So now they are defining history. Okay, in history we always talk about the changes, right? Whether in Indian history there was no change, or Indian society there was no change. So somehow they applied the Hegelian idea and they tried to prove that Indian society was a stagnant society. So that is one of the things which was very, somehow we can say now they have started using some broader theories for the history, and that's the most important thing, right? But at the same time they have started discussing about some some new things, such as like now they have started focusing more on the political history, right? Write it down. In their writing, the political elements always dominated. The political writings always dominated. I think it's not necessary to discuss. You can understand, right? So society was never important, right? It was always polity. So always they tried to reconstruct the history of the ruling dynasties rather than the common society, right? Just continue that. At the same time, they justified the colonial rule justified the colonial rule, that they could continue the colonial rule or the British rule in India. Now, Indian nationalist historiography. Sorry?
Is this the fourth point?
No. Now, this is the basically we have started a tradition from the Orientalists, right? So somehow they were just coming from the same group or the same trend. So the Orientalists, the Indologists, right? And then I told you about imperialist, right? And finally the imperialist colonial, and then finally the imperialist historiography, right? So I basically discussed about the four schools, right? And now out of basically this is the next tradition that could be seen in Indian history writing, that is the Indian nationalist historiography, right? Just give me a break of 2-3 minutes. So now once it comes to the Indian nationalist historiography. So basically we need to understand very easily one thing, very commonly one thing, that it was nothing but a sort of Indian response, right? And this Indian response could be understood into two different directions, right? So basically the first thing that is very popular, that I hope you can understand, ki the response could be felt over the Indian social reformation movement, right? Indian social reformation movement. So somehow whatever the criticism which was done by the people, basically the Orientalists, not Orientalists, or we can say imperialist writers, Orientalists and the imperialists, right? Right. So as it was criticized by the Orientalists, right, Indian society was criticized by the Orientalists and the imperialist people. ये on है ना? Right. So Indian and the Orientalist people. So sorry, the Orientalists and the imperialist people. So basically it was felt by some of the some of the people from India, and somehow they started giving the response. But as I told you that as it could be felt in two different directions, right? So there were few people, those who accepted those criticism, and in fact they also started advocating about the reforms in Indian society, right? So as you do know, like you will remember some of the early social reformers, right, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and all. So simultaneously they started in another process, right? And though they also started writing something, right? And that is, and in fact there was one thing you must notice, that they are not professionally historians, right? But somehow because of the colonial criticism they intended to write the history, right? And that is why we can say is sometimes they accepted those criticism, and as I was talking about the social reformers, right? And they started advocating the reforms in society, and at the same time parallelly they kept on writing the history of India with a different direction or within another direction, right? But once they are writing the history, as I'm to I told you that they were not professionally historians, and that is why they are writing never reflecting, it was never reflecting the real history or the history which was more based on sources, right? Look, some criticism which were done by the colonial people, these might be right also, right? Suppose they are talking about Oriental despotism, right? So somehow it might be, to some extent it might be true also, right? But somehow they were not ready to accept those kind of things. So if the people, those are like the or the Oriental people or the imperialist writers, if they are writing about that Indians were never aware of any sort of republic or oligarchic states or this particular feature, so they desperately tried to prove there was an oligarchic states, right? If they were talking about the the worst condition of women, right? So they just tried to get the idea of Rigvedic society, right? They just tried to revive the idea of Rigvedic society, just to show the the world that no, actually the women were respected properly, and that is where sometimes you'll find that they just came up with some false ideas, and these ideas might not be true, right? These were just we can say desperate effort, right? Desperate efforts by some of the people, right, just to justify or just to prove them wrong. So that was the prime intention. But definitely there were some people, those who are coming up with the same they were coming up because of the same criticism, but somehow they were just trying to write the professional historian. And that is why there in their writing you will find that sometimes they were not writing, and they were actually writing whatever was true. And that is why we can say this got divided into two different directions, right? One, those who simply tried to write down, to answer the colonial criticism, and at the same time we'll find certain people, those who are not writing with that inspiration only, rather they just try to create an actual history of India, right? Just write something. Sorry.
So the reform movements which were launched in India,
Mm-hmm.
whenever we were accepting the claims of these historians.
Yeah, to some extent they accepted it, because if they are saying that the status of Indian women is not up to the mark, is not good, so they accepted it, right? They never tried to justify it as per the Indian social values, right? So yes, so they accepted it, and that is why they advocated the reforms in society, right? As a response of colonial writing, as a response of the colonial writing, the Indians also started writing a history of India writing history of India so the nationalist historians and the nationalist historiography nationalist historians and the nationalist historiography are only terms used in a comparative sense. Used in a comparative sense in contrast to the colonial or imperialist or nationalist historians and nationalist historiography are only terms used in a comparative sense in contrast to the colonial or imperialist attitude of Britishers. They were filled with legitimate national pride, national pride in the process of writing history. They started focusing more on religion and society. Religion and society. More on religion and society. Specifically, it was done by the social reformers. That is the reason that they also came up with some wrong concepts or unacceptable concepts such as the ancient republican systems, a complete comma and a complete opposite Aryan theory, opposite Aryan theory, wrong interpretation of Vedas, wrong interpretation of Vedas, local self-government under Cholas, change the paragraph. But there were some historians those who used sources properly, to write the history, such as R.C. Datta, name of the book is Civilizations in Ancient India, R.C. Datta, sorry, R.C. Dutt, it's not Datta, it's Ramesh Chandra, that's a different fellow, R.C. Dutt. R.K. Mukherjee, in bracket you write down a history of shipping, history of Indian shipping, a history of Indian shipping and maritime activity. Maritime activity, etc. They tried to write more on material culture, politics and material culture, politics and administration. Tired? Pakka. These are few areas where I have to dictate. Why? Because that is not there in notes, right? That's the reason that I am dictating more, right? Once this topic is over, then definitely that process would be less, the process of writing and dictating. Okay, fine. But even these historians sometimes came with wrong conclusions, such as the desperate effort to show Indian unity, such as Indian unity. desperate effort to sow Indian unity. Look, they always considered that India is a fragmented country, right? There is no as such notion of India. Partially true, right? But they desperately tried to show India as a single unit, right? And that's the reason that we always talk about. Can you tell me what? There were few topics which is always there in Indian history, and then we always need to discuss this while discussing those topics, right? This is supposed to be one of the burning topic in Indian history. I hope you do know Mauryan Empire, and I hope you might have heard about the Mauryan centralization, right? Why these people were so desperate to prove it was a centralized rule, Gupta centralization, right? They talk about Ashoka, they talk about Akbar. Sometimes they talk about the character of centralizations in the state. Why? Because they were trying to prove, they always tried to prove that India was always a fragmented state, right? There was no as such notion of India. So sometimes they desperately tried to prove that at least during the period of Chandragupta, Ashoka, Akbar, the whole India was united and it was a centralized state, right? And as you do know, I hope we'll study later on that this idea later on discarded, that India was a centralized state, because now, such as for the Mauryan Empire, for a very long period of time we always thought that Mauryan Empire was a centralized state, and somehow Arthashastra was approving this also. But later on, if you'll read Romila Thapar, you'll find no, it was not true, right? Actually there was a very few area which was completely under the control of the Mauryans, and rest of the areas were actually giving tribute to the Mauryan rulers. Samudragupta always became a important figure in Indian history. And who are the people, those who highlighted Samudragupta? The nationalists. Why? Because it has been that Prayag inscription is giving the list of the rulers, those who are defeated by Samudragupta, right? We don't know to what extent it is true, right? But that evidence has been considered by them as the most important one. Why? Because somehow what is happening, this is capable of proving the fact that Samudragupta was ruling on the complete year. That's the reason that they are comparing Samudragupta with Napoleon, that he was a Napoleon of India, right? So these are some efforts. Even though they tried to write an real history of India, it was more scientific. But even though sometimes they committed mistake, but yes, the nationalist historian at least had certain positive sides, right? Even though we did discuss about some of the things, but apart from this, they had certain positive sides, right? Okay, that might not be a true history of India, but somehow they were capable of generating a anti-colonial feeling in India. Getting my point, right? So that's one of the positive sides. The next, at least they started the tradition of debating in India, right? Okay, that might be possible that you are saying the wrong fact, right? But at least that debate started in India. They are saying there was no republican, or there was an Oriental despotism. They are saying no, there was some republican system also. So somehow that debate comes up, at least the debate of regarding centralization and some others, right? So at least these two important contributions are there of these fellows, right? Right here. Apart from all these, definitely the nationalist historians succeeded. The nationalist historians succeeded in generating the anti-colonial feeling in India. Anti-colonial feeling in India. At the same time, anti-colonial feeling in India, at the same time, they at least got the tradition of reinterpretation of Indian history, right? Change the paragraph. Obviously, there were so many weaknesses inherent in nationalist historiography. Write in point wise. First, methodological defects. I'm just trying to make you understand and giving some, just some facts to support the argument, right? So look, real history must be based on sources, right? And there were so many historians that you might have studied in NCERT, such as K.P. Jaisawal, A.S. Altekar, right, and many more, right? So there were so many historians, those who just tried to answer the colonial criticism, and they never followed the historical method to write the history, right? And because of that, we cannot count it, or we cannot we cannot say that this history was a true history or the real history, right? So the methodology which was used by them, that was definitely defective. The best example for this, K.P. Jaisawal was writing a book called Hindu Polity, right? Hindu Polity, and that book desperately tried to prove the centralized character of the Mauryan Empire. So in fact, he was not using any source as such. Later on, this idea was based on Arthashastra, but initially he was not, giving any source. So somehow they started a wrong tradition in the, in history writing, and that's that was not a healthy practice in history writing, right? So you just write down in some points only, right? The historical methods were not used, such as using evidences and sources. Example, the book by K.P. Jaisawal, Hindu Polity. K.P. Jaisawal. Tried to prove the centralized character of the state, tried to prove the centralized character of Mauryan state and responsible government during ancient India. Responsible government. Next point, chauvinistic claims. Chauvinistic claims. Just simple thing. I think you can write a lot in this. False glory. That's the only word sufficient to make you understand. False glory. Next. Self-contradictions. Contradictions. Contradictions. Self-contradictions. Sometimes they were giving the contradictory arguments. Such as, can you tell me any example? No, I'm just giving a simple example. The Mauryans were militarily very powerful, right? And they are known for their imperialism, right? And at the same time, they talked about the non-violence, right? The Buddhist non-violence was being followed by them, right? So these two ideas were contradictory. Later on, some resemblance, right, or some some sort of coordination was established. Okay, fine. Magadhan imperialism was a different sort of thing, and in fact, it was proved that it was not imperialism, right? Normally, people always knew about the Magadhan imperialism, that it was a sort of, they just tried to colonize rest of the parts of India, right? So somehow, these kind of ideas were there, and these were contradictory. So that's the another important point that you must remember. Next, the biggest drawback of this school was definitely communalism. Communalism, right? I hope you understand in what way they promoted the communalism. Can you tell me about that? How did they promote promote communalism?
So they were the persons who divide history into
Communalism. Once I say communalism, it means that only Hindu and Muslim community, at least in India.
So they divide history into three phases, I think, Hindu history, Muslim history.
They didn't do it. It was done by the colonial people. Exactly. Have you ever found any as such example, those who are writing about the medieval period? They all are writing for ancient period. All the time I am just mentioning about the republican system in ancient, Mauryan Empire in ancient, right? Whatever I have said, for the sake of example, these all are from ancient. Why? Because they were only writing for the ancient India. Somehow they just completely cut the Muslims from the mainstream society, right? And it is not only about that also, right? At the same time, you must note down one more thing. As I told you that some people, those who are not professionally historians, they also started writing the history of India, and in fact they very easily proved one thing, that the ancient past was actually glorious. The ancient past was actually glorious. Indian society had to face certain problems because of the coming of the Muslims, or the drawbacks in society are coming because of the Muslims, those who came into. Got the point, right? So somehow they always glorified the Hindu past. Nobody bothered for the Muslim past. And mind you, there were no historians, those who are writing for the medieval period. And much late you'll find that people have started writing the, right? Where you have written the achievements or the positive sides of this school, just add two more points. Before this, criticism, you are writing the positive sides, no? Add simply 2 points, you'll be able to understand. regional history, right? They are the first people who started writing the regional history as well. Regional history. And the second, economic history. Economic history. That's all for the nationalist historians, right? Because there was, we could go have, we could have studied about those, authors and all, but no question is going to come. So a basic idea is sufficient, right? Now it could be used anywhere, because if you do understand the nature of Indian, nationalist historiography, it could be used anywhere, right? So now we are left with two schools, right? These are the Marxists, right, and the subaltern, right? So more or less we can say same school, because subalterns were not altogether different from Marxists. Subalterns were one of the sections within the Marxism only. That we are going to cover in the next class, right? I could have covered it today only, but I am not feeling well today, and that is why I have to leave, the class right now, right? One more thing, this is not for you guys. There was numbers of people, those who are watching it online, right? So look, there's somebody can do it from here also. You just create a WhatsApp group, right? You just create a WhatsApp group, or should I? I'll be the, ये क्या बोलते हैं इसको, group admin. Group, okay, fine. So I'm just writing my number 850-680-1232. This is my number, right? And we'll just create a group, right? That would somehow help the online people at least, right? And in fact, you people as well, right? So this is my WhatsApp number. So okay, we can create a group, right? Okay, fine. I'll be creating a group, right? And you people just join the group, right? You just tell me a number. I'll just include you in that group, right? And the online people also, right? You just save my number, give me a request, right? I'll just include you in the group, and whatever the queries are there, right? Sometimes if suppose you are reading something, you are getting a query, right? So at least if it is a brief query, you can discuss it over that also, right? So, but if it is important. And one more thing, please, this is a simple and humble request, right? That whenever the phone beeps, right, it creates problem, right? So I think there would be always a healthy discussion, because I think there would be a good number of people in that, so must be around 50, right? So I think if it is around 50, so if it is, any illogical talk or illogical conversation is going on, so somehow it is creating problem. So that group is just going to be created for some healthy reason, right? So I think he'll be just utilizing it for the UPSC only, and definitely for the discussion of history, right? So I'll just make a group, and you people give me request, right? And I'll save your number, and then I'll include it, right? So you all save my number, and in WhatsApp you can send me a message, right? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm always, look, as far as this, ye is concerned. So look, normally from 8 to 11 or even 12, right? I'm comfortable in talking during the night time, right? I'm more comfortable after 11. Because I have a, little daughter. She's 3 years old. And by the time she is awake actually, right? She never allows me to do anything. And if the phone is with her, I cannot take it back, right? So sometimes it seems quite difficult for me to, snatch the phone with her. And that is why after 11 she used to go for sleep, because in morning she has to go to school. So after 11 I'm comfortable. That's from my side it's not a problem. I won't cut the phone, because before 12 I'm completely fine. But if it is urgent, we need to discuss it. You want to ask something? Yes. Please. No, please.
So first question is, where did the Orientalism?
We'll discuss that. Don't worry.
And my second question is that Orientalists say that Aryans were the reason for our development.
Yeah.
So that's my doubt. Like, where did it originate? How can we get Europeans?
Look, there are so many theories, right? So that there's no point of discussing that. In fact, it would be a proper theme to be discussed, right? So definitely, while doing the Vedic period, the first topic that we need to discuss, that is the origin of the Aryans, right? So that's that. I mean, this is not a sort of the question must be answered right now. It should not be answered right now. The first thing, and okay, one more thing I wanted to tell you guys, right? So tomorrow we'll be beginning with sources, because we are just left with Marxism. That would that will hardly take half an hour, right? And then tomorrow we'll begin with the sources. So please come after reading the sources from NCERT. Right? That's the only thing that you need to do. So come after reading the sources, and tomorrow I'll try to finish the sources. Right? Have you seen the notes? Right? Sorry? Chapter 1 sources. So after the class you can consult the material, right? Before the before the class you just need to go through the NCERT.